بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. من منا لا يشرب القهوة، ومن منا لا يشرب الشاي والمنشطات الأخرى الموجودة في الأعشاب كالنعناع وغيرها. نعلم بأن مادة الكافيين موجودة بكثرة في القهوة. ماذا تفعل مادة الكافيين؟ إنها تنشط الجهاز العصبي، ولكن تناولها بكميات ولو قليلة ولفترة طويلة قد تسبب الإدمان، مما يضطرنا إلى شرب كمية أكبر لتنشيط الجهاز العصبي. الجهاز العصبي عندنا يتأثر بكثير من المؤثرات الخارجية، مما يسبب تعطله. من هذه الأمور أن يتعرض الرأس إلى صدمة، وهذه الصدمة قد تؤدي إلى دوخة أو فقدان وعي إذا كانت بسيطة، ولكن إذا كانت شديدة قد تؤدي إلى تلف في أحد أجزاء الدماغ، بالتالي مما يسبب شلل. هذا الشلل يصيب الجزء الذي تعطلت خلاياه العصبية في الدماغ. قد يصاب الدماغ بما يسمى الستروك أو الجلطة الدماغية. الجلطة كما هو معلوم هي عبارة عن تخثر أو تجلط للدم في أحد الأوعية في الجسم، ولكن عندما نتكلم عن الدماغ فهي إذن تتشكل في أحد أوعية الدماغ. قد تكون صغيرة تعيق مرور الدم، ولكن قد تكون كبيرة تمنع مرور الدم، وبحسب حجمها ومكانها يكون تأثيرها شديدا أو قليلا. وفي كل الأحوال الجلطة الدماغية لها تأثير خطير على جسم الإنسان، لأنها تمنع وصول الغذاء والأكسجين إلى الدماغ. لنتابع هذا الفيلم.
A stroke may occur when there is an insufficient supply of blood to a brain region, or when damage to the vasculature in a specific brain region causes bleeding into the nervous tissue. In general, there are three types of strokes that occur. They are classified based on the type of vascular defect that causes them. Cerebral hemorrhaging occurs when a vessel bursts, causing bleeding in a region of the cerebral cortex. An embolic stroke occurs when small clots that formed on other parts of the circulatory system occlude cerebral arteries and cut off the blood supply to a part of the cerebral cortex. An ischemic stroke occurs when a narrowing or blockage of cerebral vasculature results in oxygen deprivation in a specific part of the cerebral cortex. The specific functional deficits observed in someone who has suffered a stroke can be correlated with the functions of the damaged cortical region. In a healthy brain, the nerve impulses from the cerebral cortex travel through the brain and cross over to the opposite contralateral side of the body. When a stroke occurs, damage to the cortex is usually unilateral, since information to and from the cortex crosses over the midline. The effects of a stroke on the left side of the brain occur on the right side of the body. A person who has suffered a stroke may experience paralysis that may involve the face, weakness or paralysis of limbs, often limited to one side of the body, loss of sensation that parallels paralysis, difficulty with speech, double vision, loss of vision, dizziness or vomiting, severe headache, loss of consciousness.
فإذا الجلطة الدماغية تؤدي إلى ضرر كبير، ومن الأشياء التي يمكن أن تصيب الجهاز العصبي عند الإنسان ما يسمى مرض الزهايمر. ما هو الزهايمر؟ لنتابع.
Alzheimer's disease was described for the first time in 1907 by the German psychiatrist Alois Alzheimer. In performing a histopathologic study of the brain of his patient Augustine, suffering from dementia, he brought to light the presence of two types of lesions in the brain, senile plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. He reached the conclusion of a distinct disease of the cerebral cortex. 100 years later, thanks to current scientific techniques, research has made a great leap in the understanding of the disease. We know that the brain is made up of neurons, and that these are interconnected to form a vast network. These connections, known as synapses, enable the transmission of information from one neuron to another. In Alzheimer's disease, 10 to 15 years before the appearance of the symptoms, two main lesions form in the brain: senile plaques, composed of amyloid beta protein, and neurofibrillary tangles, composed of tau protein. How is the senile plaque formed? On the surface of the neuron is a large protein called APP. Normally, APP is sectioned by enzymes on the surface of the neuron, and it frees a protein called amyloid beta. The amyloid beta protein is then cleared in the body. In the case of Alzheimer's disease, there is an imbalance. The amyloid beta protein is no longer regulated and is found in too great a quantity. The proteins assemble to form indissoluble fibrils and create senile plaques.
فإذا سبب هذا المرض هو ترسب بروتينات معينة حول الخلايا العصبية ما يؤدي إلى تعطل عملها. نشاهد.
Tau protein. The abnormal accumulation of tau filaments in the neuron creates neurofibrillary tangles and eventually causes the death of the neuron. Of the lesions corresponds with the
من الأمراض الأخرى مرض التصلب اللويحي المتعدي. شاهدنا في هذا الشكل خليتان عصبيتان، إحداهما لها محور مغلف بالميلين للجهة اليسار، والأخرى غير مغلف أو الغلاف تم تلفه. طبعا هذا المرض هو نتيجة تلف مادة الميلين، بالتالي مما يؤدي إلى إعاقة حركة العضلات وحركة أعضاء الجسم. نتابع هذا الفيلم.
Multiple sclerosis, or MS, is a progressive disease of the central nervous system in adults, affecting around 2.5 million people worldwide. MS affects the ability of nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord to communicate with each other effectively. Nerve cells communicate by sending electrical signals down long fibers called axons, which are contained within an insulating substance called myelin. Evidence suggests that MS results from an autoimmune reaction, in which a malfunctioning immune system produces T cells that react with and damage the body's own cells. In MS, an unknown trigger activates helper T cells. This enables the T cells to adhere to and cross over the blood-brain barrier, which normally prohibits the flow of substances into the brain. Antigen-specific receptors on the surface of T cells recognize central nervous system myelin as an antigen. The T cells attack the myelin that surrounds the axons. This causes the central nervous system to lose some of its ability to send signals throughout the body, causing the debilitating symptoms of MS. almost any neurological symptom can appear with the disease, and often progresses to physical and cognitive disability. Permanent neurological problems often occur, especially as the disease advances. After injury, the central nervous system can repair itself. However, after repeated inflammatory attacks, this repair mechanism can become less successful. Current treatments primarily target the inflammatory elements of the disease and are somewhat effective. Innovative treatments are required that can directly target the central nervous system, not only reducing inflammation, but also inducing repair of the damaged tissue.
فإذا هذا المرض يشبه مرض شلل الأطفال من حيث النتيجة، ولكن مرض شلل الأطفال يمكن الوقاية منه بأخذ اللقاح، أما هذا فلا يمكن الوقاية منه وليس له أي علاج. فمن الأمراض الأخرى مرض باركنسون.
A chemical known as dopamine is released from an area of the brain called the substantia nigra. This neurotransmitter is released by neurons onto adjacent cells and into a synapse, sending a signal that enables smooth, coordinated muscle movement. In Parkinson's disease, dopamine released by the substantia nigra is diminished. In response, the adjacent areas of the thalamus and globus pallidus interna become overactive, creating a resultant tremor.
إذا كما لاحظنا بأن مرض باركنسون هو مرض ينتج عن عدم انتقال المادة الناقلة في المشتبك العصبي من الخلية ما قبل المشتبك إلى الخلية ما بعد المشتبك، إلى أحد الإفراد والرعشة وغيرها من الأعراض. الأدوية والعقاقير ذات تأثير كبير على جسم الإنسان، وتصنف مبدئيا إلى 4 أنواع. هذه الأنواع لا تأثير مباشر على الجهاز العصبي. المجموعة الأولى تسمى منشطات، ثانية مهبطات، مهلوسات، مخدرات. كأمثلة عليها الكوكايين والأنفيتامين، باربينات، مسكنات، مسكالين، هيروين، مشتقات أفيون وكوكايين. طبعا كل منها تأثيرها على الجهاز العصبي، لكن كلها ذات أضرار كبيرة وخطيرة تسبب الإدمان. هذا الأفيون.
Addiction is a neurological disorder that affects the reward system in the brain. In a healthy person, the reward system reinforces important behaviors that are essential for survival, such as eating, drinking, sex, and social interaction. For example, the reward system ensures that you reach for food when you are hungry, because you know that after eating you will feel good. In other words, it makes the activity of eating pleasurable and memorable, so you would want to do it again and again whenever you feel hungry. Drugs of abuse hijack the system, turning the person's natural needs into drug needs. The brain consists of billions of neurons, or nerve cells, which communicate via chemical messages, or neurotransmitters. When a neuron is sufficiently stimulated, an electrical impulse called an action potential is generated and travels down the axon to the nerve terminal.
Here it triggers the release of a neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, a space between neurons. The neurotransmitter then binds to a receptor on a neighboring neuron, generating a signal in it, thereby transmitting the information to that neuron. The major reward pathways involve transmission of the neurotransmitter dopamine from the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, of the midbrain to the limbic system and the frontal cortex. Engaging in enjoyable activities generates action potentials in dopamine-producing neurons of the VTA. This causes dopamine release from the neurons into the synaptic space. Dopamine then binds to and stimulates dopamine receptor on the receiving neuron. This stimulation by dopamine is believed to produce pleasurable feelings or rewarding effects. Dopamine molecules are then removed from the synaptic space and transported back into the transmitting neuron by a special protein called dopamine transporter. Most drugs of abuse increase the level of dopamine in a reward pathway. Some drugs such as alcohol, heroin, and nicotine indirectly excite.
إذا الكحول والهيروين والنيكوتين لها تأثيرات ضارة على الجهاز العصبي ومتابعة.
The dopamine-producing neurons in the VTA so that they generate more action potentials. Cocaine acts at the nerve terminal. It binds to dopamine transporter and blocks the reuptake of dopamine. Methamphetamine, a psychostimulant, acts similarly to cocaine in blocking dopamine removal. In addition, it can enter the neuron into the dopamine-containing vesicles, where it triggers dopamine release even in the absence of action potentials. Different drugs act in different ways, but the common outcome is that dopamine builds up in the synapse to a much greater amount than normal. This causes a continuous stimulation, maybe overstimulation of receiving neurons, and is responsible for prolonged and intense euphoria experienced by drug users. Repeated exposure to dopamine surges caused by drugs eventually desensitizes the reward system. The system is no longer responsive to everyday stimuli. The only thing that is rewarding is the drug. That is how drugs change the person's life priority. After some time, even the drug loses its ability to reward, and higher doses are required to achieve the rewarding effect. This ultimately leads to drug overdose.
إذا شاهدنا الفيلم السابق الذي يوضح تعاطي وتناول بعض المواد المؤثرة على الجهاز العصبي وآلية عملها في الدماغ. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.